It's a time in our service where we collect an offering. To those attending MCC Boston through our YouTube page, you too can participate by going to our website at mccboston.org and clicking on the donate button there for that purpose. Thank you for being a part of our church family. Members and friends of MCC Boston, there were recently two divergent stories in the news reminding us of the connected need of our witness as a queer community of faith, while also validating our decades-long work in tearing down walls of queer oppression. The first news story was the sad tale of the arrest of 9 gay men by Maryland policemen for so-called perverted sexual practices. Police officers in riot gear burst into a bookstore and charged individuals with a law widely viewed as unconstitutional. For those that don't know, perverted sexual practice is another name for Maryland's anti-sodomy law. Through the Supreme Court's 2003 Lawrence versus Texas ruling invalidated bans on consensual sodomy, many states still have such laws on the books, and they are enforced even if it runs afoul of federal law. The men that were arrested were forced to spend the night in jail. The second story was a history-making election where the Methodist Church in Britain has become the largest religious denomination to allow same-sex marriages. A vote to change the definition of marriage at the Methodist Conference overwhelmingly passed. The Methodist Church is Britain's 4th largest Christian denomination, with about 164,000 members across more than 4,000 churches. The Reverend Sam McBratney, chair of Dignity and Worth Campaign Group, said it was a momentous step on the road to justice after many years of painful conversations, and then went on to say, "We are so grateful to our fellow Methodists for taking this courageous step to recognize and affirm the value and worth of LGBTQ+ relationships." Two stories, one discriminatory and one of celebration, reminds us of the importance of being MCC. To live and worship openly, telling our stories and demonstrating our queer Christian works, so that others can witness our lamp upon the shelf and come to understand and embrace our living open and authentic lives. Your support and participation here at MCC Boston helps in reaching this goal. So this week, let us give thanks for the blessings of MCC's decades of work, enabling us the opportunity to live and worship openly, and then let us commit to live authentic, visible lives, to shine the light of God's limitless love, and be beacons of hope in all areas where oppression still abounds.
The reading is from John chapter 6, verses 1 to 21. After this, Jesus went across the Galilee Sea. A large crowd followed him because they had seen the miraculous signs he had done among the sick. Jesus went up a mountain and sat there with his disciples. It was nearly time for Passover, the Jewish festival. Jesus looked up and saw the large crowd coming towards him. He asked Philip, "Where will we buy food to feed these people?" Jesus said this to test him, for he already knew what he was going to do. Philip replied, "More than a half-year's salary's worth of food wouldn't be enough for each person to have even a little bit." One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said, "A youth here has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what good is that for a crowd like this?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass there. They sat down, about 5,000 of them. Then Jesus took the bread. When he had given thanks, he distributed it to those who were sitting there. He did the same with the fish, each getting as much as they wanted. When they had plenty to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather up the leftover pieces so that nothing will be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves that they had been left over by those who had eaten. When the people saw that he had done a miraculous sign, they said, "This is truly the prophet who is coming into the world." Jesus understood that they were about to come and force him to be their king, so he took refuge again, alone on a mountain. When evening came, Jesus' disciples went down to the lake. They got into a boat and were crossing the lake to Capernaum. It was already getting dark, and Jesus hadn't come to them yet. The water was getting rough because a strong wind was blowing. When the wind had driven them out for about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the water. He was approaching the boat, and they were afraid. He said to them, "I am. Don't be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and just then the boat reached the land where they had been heading.
So there is a particular interpretation of this story of Jesus feeding the 5,000 that I hate so very, very much. It goes like this. The apostles pointed out to Jesus that they needed to feed everybody and they didn't have enough food, but there is one little boy with some barley loaves and fish, both, by the way, food suggesting the poverty of the crowd gathered and their dependence on the land they live on. So Jesus begins to feed the crowd with this small amount of food the little boy has provided, and lo and behold, the crowd sees this, and one by one they each begin to pull out food they had come prepared with, and that gets shared as well. So a wave of generosity spreads through the crowd until everyone is fed and happy, and they have even more food left over than they started with. All because they believed in the power of community and sharing with each other. Now, I am a firm believer in the power of community and sharing with each other, sincerely. But I am not comfortable with retelling the story in this way for a number of reasons. For one thing, the issue facing this community at this time is one of food scarcity. They don't have enough to feed themselves. This is, unfortunately, a reality that many around us face on a daily basis. However, when we make the solution to that problem, everyone started sharing their food with one another, and then there was enough for everyone. The unfortunate implication there is that the problem was always with the community itself. You're essentially communicating to us that the community gathered, far and away a community living in poverty, is just too greedy and selfish to work together to ensure that everyone is fed, unless a cute little boy shows up with barley loaves. Now keep in mind, the community in question is an exceedingly poor one, beset upon by an occupying military force. An occupying military force who practices taxation, regularly requiring the poor to give up their goods and livestock for the sake of the empire. In this context, to suggest that the community would be better fed if they pooled their resources is technically correct, but it also ignores the source of the problem. The food is scarce not because everyone in the local native Jewish community is too selfish to care for their neighbors. Food is scarce because the occupying military force requires their occupied communities to contribute their own food sources to the powers of empire. If said occupied people were better at sharing food with each other, would that help? Sure. Should we expect them to shoulder the burden of food scarcity themselves? Absolutely not. They're not the cause of the problem, so it would be offensive and insulting for us to suggest that they're the ones who are responsible for solving the problem. Moreover, in our context, it may be appropriate to encourage marginalized communities to focus on caring for themselves. In this time and place, that would also be insulting because this is a community that has already been conquered in a military sense, which means this community has already tried to join their forces and their resources to fight for their own well-being, and they failed. It didn't work. So while they may be able to band together to meet the basic survival needs of the poorest among them, it is ridiculous of us to ask that they assume responsibility for that. This is a community that, with all of them joining forces, could not defeat the military might of the Roman Empire. To suggest that all of the same forces and resources joining could solve the food scarcity in their midst is also somewhat correct, but ignores the source of the issue. But did I accidentally repeat the page? Sorry about that. Jesus, everything wrong tonight. I've never slipped up like this. I don't wing it. Who do you think you're talking to? For those occupied by the Roman Empire to band their resources together to care for each other is equally insulting. It may be possible, but it leaves us with a world in which the poor struggle to meet the needs of the rich, which does not feel like Jesus' intention here. These are a people starving for sustenance. Encouraging them to spread what little they have around to keep alive the poorest among them is not God's justice, because they're already more than aware that they have no more among them, even when pooled together, but enough for basic sustenance. And forget about supporting a military operation against the empire. They've tried that. It led only to fewer resources divided among them. But beyond all of these practical concerns, I'm also not necessarily a fan of this impulse to remove miracle from biblical accounts of Jesus performing miracles, which is an impulse that many in our society fall prey to because we do live in a different time period. When we want to know why there's thunder or floods or a world in the first place, we no longer turn to religion, myth, or folklore for this. We don't tell stories about the gods to explain the world, which means that we, as a people, are less desirous of miracles and divine powers to explain things. In this context, it can be easy and tempting to try to remove the unbelievable from the ancient stories we rely on. We think that if we just take the miracles out to make these stories a little more palatable for those who have trouble believing in the miraculous, that they'll all suddenly see the beauty of faith. But I don't think that really works like people expect. And I also think there's something important lost there. Because without miracle, when we read this story, we basically leave the gathered community to figure things out for themselves. When they don't have enough food for the community, we tell them to dig deep into their pockets, instead of acknowledging that there's a reason for their hunger that lies outside of the scope of their abilities. The people in this story are begging for a savior to ensure that they have enough to eat, and here we all are telling them that if they just carefully watch their appetites and distribute evenly, then they can afford to keep everyone alive and hungry for a long time to come, even with a hostile foreign power taking half of everything they have. This is not the good news of Jesus Christ. Instead, this reading of the text renders us essentially an atheistic tradition. We may profess belief in God, but at the same time, do we believe in a God that does anything to care for her people? If we believe in a God who would let her people be starved out by a nation with greater military might, and then ask them to faithfully distribute what little they have left, then we sacrifice a God of providence and deliverance, who cares for her people and is invested in finding a better life for them. We put forward a system in which the oppressed and marginalized must care for themselves and each other, with no assistance from the God we claim loves justice and the impoverished. More troublesome, by doing this, we remove the hope from this passage. These are a starving people. While better distribution may help them solve the worst of the food scarcity, this does nothing to address the root of the problem. These are people looking for hope. And probably like you, I've never been a starving person facing food scarcity. But if I were, I don't think I'd be thrilled to hear, "Don't worry, if you share your food with the rest of the community, then you'll all have enough to get by, and maybe a loaf or two left over." There is no hope in telling a struggling community that if they just struggle a little harder, they'll be able to make it through the worst of the danger. What the people are looking for is a word or a sign that they will soon be done worrying about where to find sustenance, that they will be cared for. A magic man multiplying bread might accomplish that. A small boy encouraging everyone to share better communicates no such hope. Beyond that, we lose out on the magic in the text if we explain away all the miracles. And I think the magic serves a purpose, because I too am a person with limited social capital attempting to make it through and care for others. And I feel better knowing there's a God with power beyond my own who cares about addressing the same injustice in society. Because I am trying what I can to make this a better world for all of us, and my powers in that respect are limited. Just as the ancient Israelites did not have the power to overthrow the evil occupying forces that kept them starving, I also do not have the power to undo the unjust systems that I live in. I also cannot fix the problem by trying harder. And trust me on that, because I have tried trying harder a lot. So it's nice to believe that there is someone out there with abilities beyond my own who cares about justice. I believe that there is a considerable disservice done when we attempt to explain away these less believable parts of the Bible. Not only do we cede the conversation to those who won't believe in the impossible, even when the impossible is exactly what we need to believe in, because believing only in the possible, in the everyday, in the ordinary, is exactly what got us into this mess in the first place. When you believe so hard in a world in which the impossible cannot happen and change cannot come and things don't get better, you find yourself living in that world. You forfeit the magic of these stories, and all stories should be magical to a certain extent. Otherwise, they're just the news. But on the other hand, the opposite extreme is equally unsuitable, and we see plenty of this too. The people who insist that you're not a real Christian if you don't believe in the virgin birth or the physical resurrection or a 7-day creation or miracle passages like these. I'm sure we all know people who will insist that we have to take every single word of the Bible as absolute literal truth, since metaphor wasn't invented until the 18th century and all. People who will say that we must believe the miracles of Jesus exactly as they were written. Now, I like believing in miracles, but I also recognize that that's a choice I make about the life I want to live and the world I want to live in. If we take that choice and force it on people, that super does not help. First, because insisting on the literal truth of this miraculous multiplication of bread and fish only calls to attention just how unlikely this story is. And it's supposed to be unlikely. That's what's fun. But trying to force someone into believing the unlikely does not make them more likely to believe in it. All you can do is alienate the people who might otherwise have gradually come to appreciate passages like this. You can't force them to believe anything. And if I'm being blunt, the church as a whole has really not given the wider culture a lot of reasons to trust us about things like this. Every day they can see us resisting reason and rejecting truth in the public sphere. So why on earth would they trust us when we are saying things that are literally impossible? We have to earn that trust, and that doesn't happen when you condemn people for disbelieving things that are considered unbelievable in their worldview. We also insult people's intelligence when we insist that the story must be read this way. Too much of our church infantilizes our fellow believers. So in the first place, it is not my job to tell you how to read the Bible and what to believe. Even if I were a full-time pastor, that still would not be my job. Only you can decide what these stories mean to you and what that says about how you should live your life. People like me can give you viewpoints you might consider and guide you through the process, but we absolutely can't and shouldn't tell you that you have to believe this or read it in this way or have this understanding of the text. In the church, we are supposed to be responsible adults who are capable of reading and acting and interpreting for ourselves. When you interfere with that, you undermine the spiritual journeys of your fellow believers and either drive them away or render them unthinking masses ready to believe and follow everything you say, which is also not what the church should be. But most important, when we focus on a literal reading of Jesus' miraculous acts, we are focusing on the wrong thing. These stories are meant to illustrate for us where Jesus' values are, what work he intended to do in the world. When we read this, we should be meditating on food scarcity and sharing resources, and at undoing the systems that perpetuate food inequality. We should be meditating on what it is that Jesus wants done in the world. But if we make the point of the story that Jesus has supernatural abilities, then the point of the story becomes all about how powerful Jesus is and what things he can do. The entire story just gets boiled down to Jesus is really powerful and can do cool stuff, which is true. But focusing solely on Jesus' abilities to the exclusion of his values is how we end up in a church with a white Jesus who waves the American flag and votes Republican and longs to uphold the might of the American military empire. Because we are choosing to accentuate Jesus' power without mentioning his humility. Stories like these lead us to a faith that worships power, a faith that seeks power, a faith that glorifies power, a faith that is, which stands for and seeks everything Jesus stood against and rejected, while having no idea that it isn't following Jesus. Because that faith has come to believe that Jesus' mission in the world is to demonstrate his power and not to serve the poor, like he told us all the time. So I'm leaving you in a bit of a pickle here, because I hate it when people try to rationalize miracles away, and I hate it when people insist that we have to believe in them in a literal sense. Where does that leave things? This might be a bit jarring, but I think of it like this. Many of you know I have a good amount of experience working with people with a wide variety of mental health issues. So I've had to learn how to counsel folks with many different paranoid and impossible delusions. The important thing to know about delusions is that you should never, ever directly counter them. If you do that, the person will reject you before rejecting their own lived experience, and you'll become another person in the world they can't trust and won't speak honestly with. At the same time, you should also never validate delusions, because they're unhealthy and you don't want to feed into that and confirm that for them. The middle ground that mental health workers are taught is that we should not comment at all on the reality or fictitiousness of any delusion, but instead speak directly to the feelings that are wrapped up in that. So if someone is telling me she doesn't feel safe because the FBI has cameras in the streetlights that are looking down into her room, I don't want to talk about cameras. I want to talk about her feeling unsafe, feeling threatened, and what she can do to help when she feels that way. Now, very importantly, I am not calling the Bible a delusion. Write that down. But what I am saying is that the point of this story is not the miracle. If the story went that Jesus instead gathered his apostles and they all worked really hard and prepared a big meal, I actually think it would still work pretty much the same. It's about food scarcity and inequality. It's about being in solidarity with the poor and hungry. That's what matters. What we should be doing is thinking about what this community needs, and they need miracles a little bit. They need to believe that somehow God can take care of their needs when they feel powerless over the situation. They need to believe that Jesus can calm the raging storms of their hectic lives and bring peace in the midst of trouble. They need to believe that there is a power higher than their oppressors, and that power will act in their favor. But more than miracles, this community needs food. And that one you can interpret literally. These are a hungry people of little means, and they need food in their bellies. All the miracles of Jesus would matter little if he could not also meet their needs and feed them. And when we've considered what the community in this text needs, the next thing to consider is what the community we live in and around needs, which unfortunately is probably the same thing. They need food, they need peace, they need to believe that there is a power higher than their oppressors who cares about them and wants to help them meet their needs. Now, I am someone who lives to dwell in the ambiguity of stories like this. So my preference is to never definitively answer for myself whether Jesus really performed miracles in the literal sense or not. But what is definitely unambiguously true is that we are not capable of performing miracles. So we shouldn't need to. It is possible for us to feed thousands even if we can't multiply the bread. It's possible for us to dwell in peace in the midst of a storm without literally walking on water. We are capable of replicating the acts of Jesus, whether or not we have the power to replicate the miracles. And sometimes when we need them, the miracles come. Think of the boy in this story. He comes to the crowd with what could not feel like a more insufficient offering for a crowd of thousands of people. And Jesus takes that and makes something bigger from it, and that's our job. To act in favor of the poor and distressed in whatever small, insufficient way we can, and to hope that wherever our own offerings are insufficient, God will take what we are offering and make it into something bigger, better, and higher. That's what's important. Not whether Jesus can literally multiply barley loaves, but whether we will be there to offer them up, even when they feel so small and so not enough. And then whether we will offer ourselves, even when we feel so small and so not enough. And whether we can trust that God will provide whatever we are lacking, whether or not she need perform a miracle to do so.